The termination letter used the word twice. Attitude issues and not a team player, as if the two phrases together were supposed to explain something that no one inches the room was willing to say out loud. Daniel Ruiz read it once, folded it in half, and put it in his jacket pocket without arguing. He did not mention that the software the company was about to spend $2 million acquiring from an outside vendor was, line for line, an inferior version of something he'd already built for free, on his own time. In the break room, after his shifts ended, he simply nodded, said, "Understood," and walked out through the loading dock doors for the last time. Daniel had worked the overnight shift at Halbrook Distribution for 4 years, moving pallets through a warehouse the size of 6 football fields, scanning barcodes under sodium lights that made everyone look slightly gray. He was 31, soft-spoken to the point that some people mistook it for coldness, and he had a way of watching a process for a few days before quietly fixing what was wrong with it, not because anyone asked him to, but because inefficiency bothered him the way an off-key note bothers a musician. He'd grown up the oldest of 4 kids in a house where nothing extra ever showed up, and he'd learned early that the fastest way to keep a job was to make yourself useful in ways nobody could argue with. He was good at his job. He was not good at pretending to enjoy the parts of it that deserved no enjoying. And that, more than anything else, was what people meant when they called him not a team player. His shift supervisor was a man named Corey Vance, mid-40s, the kind of manager who mistook loud enthusiasm for competence and quiet competence for insubordination. Corey ran the floor through a rotating cast of favorites, men who laughed at his jokes in the break room and volunteered for the visible tasks that got mentioned in front of regional management. Daniel did neither. He came in, did the work precisely and quickly, corrected problems without announcing that he'd corrected them, and went home. Corey found this unsettling in a way he couldn't quite articulate, and unsettling, for a man like Corey, tended to curdle into resentment. What Corey didn't know, what almost no one at Halbrook knew, was that Daniel spent most nights after his shift, and most of his days before it, teaching himself to code. He'd started 2 years earlier with free online tutorials, working through them at the kitchen table of the 1-bedroom apartment he shared with his younger brother, who was finishing community college on a scholarship that covered tuition, but nothing else. Daniel had noticed almost immediately that Halbrook's inventory routing system was bleeding money in ways nobody upstream seemed to track trucks crossing paths that should never have crossed. Pallets rerouted twice because the software didn't account for dock congestion. Hours lost every week to a logic problem that was, to Daniel, obviously solvable. He built a prototype, not because anyone asked him to, and not because he expected anything to come of it, but because the problem bothered him the way problems always did, and building things quietly in the dark was the one part of his life that felt entirely his own. He tested it against 6 months of the warehouse's actual shipping data, which he had access to through his scanner login, and it cut misrouted pallets by nearly 40%. He showed it to exactly one person, a dispatch coordinator named Priya Anand, who he trusted and who told him more than once that he needed to bring it to management before someone else did. Daniel didn't bring it to management. He told Priya he didn't want to be the guy who showed up with a big idea and got laughed out of the room for stepping outside his lane, and there was some truth in that, but underneath it was something older and harder to explain, a lifetime of learning that visibility for people like him sometimes cost more than it earned. He kept the software on a personal laptop, refined it in pieces, and told almost no one it existed. The trouble with Corey Vance had been building for months before it broke. Corey ran mandatory culture meetings twice a month, sessions built around team-building exercises that Daniel found pointless and said so. Quietly, exactly once, in a private conversation, Corey later repeated to 3 other people in a version that made Daniel sound insubordinate rather than simply tired. Corey began writing Daniel up for small things. A break that ran 4 minutes long, a scanned pallet logged 2 minutes after the shift technically ended in fractions that existed on paper, but that every other worker on the floor committed daily without consequence. Daniel understood what was happening. He'd seen it happen to other quiet people before him. He kept his head down and hoped it would pass. It did not pass. It ended on a Tuesday morning, in a small windowless HR office with a regional manager named Diane Whitfield, reading from a printed form while Corey stood by the door with his arms crossed, looking satisfied in a way he didn't bother to hide. Diane used the phrase team player twice and attitude once, and asked Daniel if he had anything he wanted to say. He thought, for one long moment, about mentioning the software, about explaining that the routing inefficiencies costing the company thousands of dollars a week had a fix sitting on his laptop at home. He looked at Corey's face, satisfied and waiting, and decided the room wasn't interested in the truth. He said he understood, signed where he was told to sign, and left. Diane Whitfield, for her part, had not enjoyed the meeting. She was newer to the region, careful and overworked, and she had looked at Daniel's file before the meeting and noticed, with some unease, that his performance metrics were clean. No missed shifts, no safety violations, output consistently above average. But Corey had built a paper trail over months, and paper trails in the world Diane worked in were treated as truth regardless of what sat underneath them. She signed off on the termination because the documentation told her to, and she told herself, the way people do, that the documentation must know something she didn't. 6 weeks later, Halbrook Distribution's regional leadership team gathered for a vendor presentation. The company had spent 4 months evaluating logistics software from an outside firm called Meridian Systems, a routing platform that promised to cut misrouted shipments and reduce dock congestion across all 12 of Halbrook's warehouses. The price tag was $2, $1 million spread across a 3-year licensing agreement, and after months of demos and negotiations, the deal was scheduled to close within the week. Diane sat in on the final presentation, along with 2 VPs and a small technical team, brought in to verify the platform's capabilities before the contract was signed. The Meridian engineer, a confident man named Trevor Holt, walked the room through the platform's core routing logic. The same logic Halbrook had been promised would solve exactly the problems Daniel had identified 2 years earlier on his own. One of the technical evaluators, a systems analyst named Marcus Webb, brought in from corporate for this exact review, asked a pointed question about how the platform handled dock congestion during peak shift overlaps. Trevor's answer was vague in the specific way. Answers get vague when the honest answer is not well. Marcus made a note. He'd seen this particular gap before. He said, in an internal prototype someone at one of the warehouses had apparently built, according to a mention buried in an old internal email thread he'd stumbled across while researching the region's shipping data. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a coincidence starts to look like something else. Diane asked what internal prototype he meant. Marcus pulled up the email thread, an old message from Priya Anand, sent 8 months earlier to a supervisor who'd never acted on it, describing a routing tool built by a warehouse associate that had reduced misrouted pallets in a 6-month test by nearly 40%. The associate's name was in the email. Daniel Ruiz. Diane sat with that for a long moment before she said anything. She remembered the name. She remembered signing his termination paperwork 6 weeks earlier, and Corey Vance's satisfied expression by the door, and the clean performance file she'd looked at and set aside because the write-up said otherwise. She asked Priya to be brought into the meeting. Priya confirmed everything in the email and added what the email hadn't said, that Daniel had built and tested the tool entirely on his own time, that he'd shown it to almost no one out of a reasonable fear of exactly what had eventually happened to him, and that as far as she knew, he still had it on a personal laptop and had never shared it with anyone at the company beyond her. Diane didn't say much for the rest of the meeting. She let Trevor Holt finish his pitch, thanked the Meridian team for their time, and told them Halbrook would be in touch before making a final decision, which was everyone in the room understood. The polite version of a delay nobody had expected. She found Daniel's contact information in the HR system that afternoon and called him herself, rather than routing it through anyone else. He didn't answer. She left a voicemail, careful and a little uncertain, asking if he'd be willing to meet, not about the termination, she said, but about something else entirely. Daniel almost didn't call back. He'd spent 6 weeks working temp shifts at a shipping warehouse across town for $2 less an hour, and he had, by that point, made a kind of peace with the idea that Halbrook was simply a chapter that had ended badly. But Priya had texted him the same afternoon, telling him, in her own words, that something had happened, and that it might actually matter this time. He called Diane back the next morning. They met at a coffee shop near the warehouse, neutral ground, Diane's choice. She didn't open with an apology. Exactly, she opened by asking him directly whether the routing tool Priya had described still existed and whether he'd be willing to show it to her. Daniel said it did, and that he would, though he was careful, at first, in the way people are careful when they've already learned what honesty costs in a room that isn't ready to hear it. He brought his laptop the following day. He walked Diane and 2 members of the technical evaluation team through the tool's logic, the dock congestion, handling that Meridian's platform had fumbled. The rerouting logic built from 6 months of the warehouse's actual shipping patterns, rather than a generic model designed to work everywhere, and therefore nowhere in particular. Marcus Webb, the systems analyst who'd first flagged the email, ran the tool against 3 months of fresh data live in the meeting. It outperformed Meridian's $2, 1 million platform on every metric they tested. Diane didn't offer him his old job back. She told him plainly that his old job had never been the right fit for what he actually was, and that offering it back would be its own kind of insult. What she offered instead was a position on the newly forming logistics technology team, reporting directly to corporate rather than to any warehouse floor supervisor, at a salary that reflected what he'd actually built, rather than what his previous title had paid. She told him the routing tool would be evaluated formally, and that if it performed the way the live test suggested, Halbrook would license it internally, instead of signing with Meridian, and that Daniel would be compensated for that separately, as the tool's creator. Daniel asked, carefully, about Corey Vance. Diane's expression tightened slightly. She told him that Corey's write-ups, once she'd gone back through them properly instead of taking them at face value, showed a pattern that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a manager who couldn't tolerate someone he didn't fully understand. She said that was being addressed separately, and that it should have been addressed months earlier, before it ever reached the point of a termination letter that used the word attitude, as though it meant something. The routing tool went into formal evaluation over the following month, refined with proper engineering support behind it for the first time, tested across 2 additional warehouses. It held up. Halbrook canceled the Meridian contract before it was ever signed, saving the $2, 1 million license fee entirely. And Daniel's tool, properly built out, properly credited, became the backbone of the routing system across all 12 of the company's warehouses within the year. Daniel didn't make a show of any of it. He took the new role, moved into a small office 2 floors above the warehouse floor he used to work, and kept doing what he'd always done, quietly and without needing anyone to notice. Priya transferred to the technology team not long after, at Daniel's specific request, because he remembered who had believed him when believing him cost her nothing to withhold. He kept the termination letter, not out of bitterness, exactly, though there was some of that in it. He kept it folded in the same jacket pocket for a while, and then eventually in a drawer at home, next to the acceptance email from the first online course. He'd ever finished a reminder. He told Priya once that the people who decide what team player means don't always know what they're looking at, and that being quiet was never the same thing as having nothing to say. Some people mistake silence for absence. It rarely is. It's usually just someone building something nobody asked them to build, waiting for the moment the work speaks for itself.